Hello, thank you for joining me in this latest video dealing with the topic of the writings of Enoch. I have a lot to cover in this one, so I'm going to be talking fairly quick. And I'm going to be dealing specifically with the canonization process. That process that took place and the people who were involved to create the Protestant Bible as we know it. Now, most Protestants are very proud of the fact, and they use this as a way of supporting their belief that we use the same Old Testament that the Jews used for their canon. So they use this as a way to add weight to the fact that their Bible is the right Bible, that the 37 books of the Old Testament is the same books that the Jews canonized. And this is supposed to be a plus. But when we look at the process that took place, this is not the case. In fact, following the Jewish canon does not make any sense whatsoever once you look at the history and what took place and why the books were chosen that were chosen. Now, before I explain what took place in the year 90 AD, which is when that first canon was created for the Jewish canon, I want to go back a bit and explain that the Pharisees and the Sadducees did not exist prior to the New Testament. They did not exist in the Old Testament as things are written in the Old Testament, in the books there. The Pharisees and the Sadducees were a new order that came out of Babylon when the Jews returned to Israel from exile. So they were really a fairly new phenomena, two new religious groups, and even themselves did not agree on a lot of things. In fact, they were in constant conflict. The Sadducees did not even believe in the resurrection, and so the writings that they chose to teach and to preach from and to live by reflected that. Now, in the year 90 AD, the Jewish leaders came up with a canon. But the reason they chose the books that they did, at least in large part, was to combat a growing cult. And that cult at that time was known as Christianity. So the very books that were denied and deleted and kept out of the canon were kept out because they led too much weight to Christianity and to the teachings of Christ. It was known at that time what books and what writings, what scriptures that Jesus and the apostles taught from, what they relied heavily on. And so the Jews, because they wanted to refute and to deny Jesus as the Messiah, and because they wanted to combat Christianity, they designed a canon that would do exactly that. The books were chosen purposely and specifically to eliminate those scriptures that added weight to Christ being the Messiah. And if the Christians were relying heavily on certain books, then those books were eliminated from the Jewish canon. And yet, 300 years later, when it came to the church creating their own canon, what do? Somebody puts their hand up and says, hey, I got an idea. To make it easier to convert Jews, why don't we use the same books for our Old Testament as what they use for their canon? And a bunch of people jumped on board and said, yeah, that's a great idea. It'll sure make it a whole lot easier if we show that we are drawing from the same books and the same teachings as what the Jews are. And so that's exactly what was done. Our Old Testament, the books that are in our Old Testament, are the same books that were used to try and deny Christianity, to deny Christ. There were books that were kept out that Jesus and the apostles used in reference to, and which pointed to Jesus being the Messiah. And those books were specifically kept out. So we see in the whole canon process Satan at work here. That it was Satan's design to eliminate some of God's word. For we are told that we are supposed to live by every word that comes from the mouth of God. But what Satan did is he designed a way to keep out some of God's word, and in doing so has caused mass confusion ever since then. Another thing I want to point out is that Constantine in 325, he did some very wrong things that Christians bought into. The one is that he picked as the date for the birth of Christ the most holy of days for the pagans, that being December 25th. So Constantine married up paganism and Christianity, and Christians bought into it because it meant that they would no longer be persecuted and killed for their beliefs. So we see that the Christians accepted Constantine, and they put up with a lot of things that the old Christians never would have. They accepted December 25th, the most holy of pagan holidays, as the date to celebrate the birth of Christ. They also accepted the change of Sabbath from the seventh day to the first day. And I want you to think about this. When we changed the Sabbath from the seventh to the first, we went as far removed from the day of the Sabbath as what we could get. We went from the seventh to the first. Think about that. The difference from the first to the seventh is as far removed from what God had planned and what God designed as what we can possibly get. And then also in 325 AD, Constantine gave the colors purple and scarlet, the robes of purple and scarlet to the church. Up to that point, the leaders of the Catholic Church were simply wearing ribbons of purple and red. But Constantine gave them these rich robes. And that is exactly how the prostitute is described in Revelations. So when you look at Revelations, we see that 325 AD was the birth of the prostitute that is mentioned in Revelations, and that being the Catholic Church. When they accepted these gifts from Constantine, these robes of red and purple, and accepted the December 25th as the celebration of Jesus Christ's birth, and when they accepted the change of the Sabbath, they were accepting pagan teachings. And this, as I said, is the birth of the prostitute talked in Revelations. And then almost 60 years after this 325 AD, the first canon of the Christian Bible came into effect. So this is why I say that the teachings of Enoch are inspired works of God. But they were kept out of the canon, not because God wanted them kept out, but because the carnal nature of man was at work, Satan was at work, and books were denied that without doubt are part of God's Word. All right, I look forward to comments, and until next time, peace and blessings.